Liberalism, section. The conflict of ideas of mission from the American Revolution to the First World War. So we can understand the recurrent divisions that opened up in the community of the free. The one that occurred in the 2 decades preceding the foundation of the United States is illuminating. The 7 Years' War was also experienced and fought by the English colonists in America, and in fact primarily by them, not only as a war for the defense of English liberty, but also, as the sermons of Protestant ministers never tired of repeating, as a holy war in which it was God himself who guided and saved England-Israel from the threat represented by France. The victory achieved over the enemies of Israel was proof of the, quote, favorable providential presence of God with his people, end quote. A few years later, it was England's turn to form the core of the alliance of the, quote, enemies of God, while the rebel American colonists continued to be true Christians, good soldiers of Jesus Christ, called upon to cultivate a martial spirit and the art of war so as to accomplish the work of the Lord. This was the first major conflict to convulse the community of the free, and it spans the period that extends from the American Revolution to the War of 1812-15. As the latter was coming to an end, Jefferson expressed the opinion that Great Britain was no less despotic than Napoleon. Moreover, while the latter would take, quote, his tyrannies to the grave with him, a whole nation was seeking to impose its absolute domination over the seas, and it was an, quote, insult to the human understanding. Such was his ideological fury that the American statesman ended up declaring, quote, our enemy has indeed the consolation of Satan on removing our first parents from paradise. From a peaceable and agricultural nation, he makes us a military and manufacturing one. End quote. Having heard the news of the end of hostilities, Jefferson wrote that it was an armistice only. So radical was the antagonism, not only of interests, but also of principles, that the two countries were in fact engaged in an eternal war, which would terminate or was destined to end with the, quote, extermination of the one or the other party, end quote. The second major conflict was the one that exploded with the American Civil War. The dialectic we have already encountered was on display once again. The fact that for decades the antagonists had regarded themselves as members of the chosen people of liberty, far from reducing the bitterness of the clash, accentuated it. Both sides were convinced that they were fighting a holy war. They appealed to Holy Scripture, and half of their propaganda texts were written by ecclesiastics. The first major conflict survived the second, which was eclipsed at the end of the 19th century by the rising tide of chauvinism that invested the United States as a whole, without significant distinctions between North and South. In 1889, Kipling noted with disappointment that the 4th of July celebrations in San Francisco were the occasion for official speeches against what the Americans defined as, quote, our natural enemy, represented by Great Britain, quote, with her chain of fortresses across the world, end quote. In reality, this antagonism too was being damped down, because a completely new international situation was maturing. More than ever engaged in colonial expansion, and increasingly taken in by the idea of the freedom mission they assigned themselves in competition with one another. Between the 19th and 20th centuries, the various national centers of the community of the free turned out to be on a collision course. This is the context in which we can situate the third major conflict in the history of liberalism. Starting with the First World War, in particular, it saw ranged against one another Britain and the United States and Germany, the most recent and ambitious recruit to the community of the free, which at the end of the 19th century had likewise begun to cherish the idea of an empire for liberty, putting itself at the head of a crusade for the abolition of slavery in the colonies. The interpretation of the third major conflict suggested here might occasion astonishment. What obstructs an understanding of this event is the negative teleology that tends to interpret German history in its entirety as a series of stages leading inexorably to the horror of the Third Reich. In reality, on the eve of the First World War, Germany was not obviously less, quote, democratic than the United States, where racial oppression raged, or than Great Britain, which completely disregarded universal male suffrage, on which elections to the Reichstag were based, and exercised imperial domination on a global scale, and even in Europe itself, at the expense of Ireland. Above all, it must not be forgotten that, at the turn of the 19th century, even in England and America, Germany was regarded as a full member of the exclusive club of free peoples. So the by now familiar dialectic emerges once again, confronting one another in a total war, which required the mobilization of culture as well as armies, were antagonists who had previously congratulated one another on being members, or even especially influential members, of the community of the free. In this case, of the great Teutonic or Aryan family, united by a jealous custodianship of individual autonomy and love of self-government and liberty. End of section.